thanks very much to Susan and to Pino for giving me the opportunity, and thanks for the lovely dinner last night as well. And apologies to those of you, I think it's only two, who have heard part of my talk 2 weeks ago in Pavia. I've tried to change it, but it's difficult in 2 weeks, yeah? So bear with me. Okay, so all of this is part of collaborative work in the frame of a British grant, which I'm still having. And what I thought I could contribute to this event is an account or some steps towards the analysis of linguistic diversity in its linkage with cognitive diversity. So how do the two relate? And to make this visually clear, this idea, I have thought of the following. So think of this as the tree of languages, and let's suppose it's single-rooted. So it's growing out of this human linguistic ability, which we may call universal grammar. So I'm just calling universal grammar the human language capacity, okay? So out of this grows the tree of languages, and it's clear that this tree of languages is not a tree of minds. So Catalans and Spaniards are as different as you can imagine in many, many respects, yeah, but in other respects they're identical, so we don't care, yeah? So it's the same minds, okay? So you do linguistic typology, comparing languages, but not minds, okay? And the idea would be to do something different, to compare different kinds of languages along with different kinds of minds, okay? So how do the kinds of diversity match? And so imagine a different tree, where the languages are not the same. You have little nameable subgroups of types of language. And they actually do have clinical profiles. You give them names like autism, Huntington's disease, mania, schizophrenia. And could it be that with each of these clinical types, there is a particular linguistic type that might actually illuminate the cognitive type in question? Okay? All of these are cognitive disorders. Yeah? They're also involving linguistic changes. So how illuminating are these linguistic changes for the cognitive changes that we see? Okay? So good linguistics contributes something to the study of cognition in terms of the study of cognitive changes. So that wouldn't be universal grammar then, because language is fundamentally changed. It's a different kind of grammar. It's a distortion of the kind of grammar that goes with normal cognition. So call it universal grammar prime or double prime. Okay? So that's the idea. So I'll focus on autism and schizophrenia, even though we have some data on language in Huntington's disease, on which virtually no data exists in terms of their linguistic profile. Yeah? So there's something interesting to say about this as well, but I will barely manage these two. So we're looking at two cognitive types here. This is widely accepted, that people with autism and with schizophrenia have a different cognitive style, as it's sometimes called, a different cognitive phenotype, or whatever you want to call it. Could these two cognitive types match with particular linguistic types? Could we have a one-to-one correlation, ideally? And if we can't, where does this one-to-one correlation fail? Yeah, even that would tell us something interesting. Yeah, so which non-linguistic variables do we have to involve? We can only ask that question, or rather answer that question, by starting from the hypothesis that there is a one-to-one correlation. Yeah? One cognitive type, one linguistic type. Okay? And to see where this fails. It's a bit like the minimalist program. Nobody believes in the strong minimalist thesis. What's interesting about it is where it fails, if it fails. Yeah? We assume it fails, but then the question is where. Okay? Okay, now there's lots of practical problems in this sort of research. One is lack of linguistic expertise in the clinics. It's a huge, huge problem. So clinicians just have absolutely no exposure to linguistic concepts. To explain the notion of a noun phrase to your normal doctor in the psychiatry wards in a clinic, they can just forget about it. You have to completely change your vocabulary. There's an enormous lack, and a surprising lack from my point of view, of sophisticated clinical tests of grammatical comprehension. So it goes to something like, I don't know, passives, reversible sentences, or things like that. More interesting grammatical phenomena. To run this as part of a clinical test that a doctor in the clinic could just administer to a patient. This simply doesn't exist at the moment, which is reflective of the lack of a linguistic perspective on mental disease. In neurolinguistics, we are still suffering, I think, from a modularist and a physiological perspective. Aphasia doesn't affect cognition, at least according to many people. So it's supposed to be a language thing, not a cognition thing. Yeah? And the way we have related language to the brain in much of the 20th century took an aphasiological, a Broca's sort of perspective as a basis. Or we look at SLI, yeah? That equally is not supposed to affect cognition. Yeah? The last linguist to look at schizophrenic language, actually in some sense, was Chaika, who wrote a paper in 1974 called A Linguist Looks at Schizophrenic Language. Yeah? How many linguists have done it since? I mean, I think the only psychiatrist in the world who has done it systematically is Tim Crow. Yeah? So, sorry, he's not a linguist. What I wanted to say, he's the only psychiatrist in the world who actually has done some reading in linguistics. Yeah? He has done some reading in Chomsky. And there's one other guy I know, who's Peter McKenna, psychiatrist in Barcelona, who actually lives in York, as it happens. And finally, systematically testing about 30 patients and building a profile of their language costs approximately £1 million. That's not a joke. So it was much easier for me when I was a philosopher, you know. There's many days when I'm cursing the decision to go into this area. It's a completely different way of working. And you're looking into years and years of work before you have a publication. Yeah? So it's really difficult. So I need support in that. Okay, so what's the standard view in both autism and schizophrenia? Well, it's one standard view, but I think it's a very popular view still. That there are cognitive deficits, yeah, that's widely accepted. Both diseases are cognitive diseases. They are not affective diseases primarily, so they involve cognitive problems. And the cognitive problem is a problem in some sort of neurocognitive variable that's usually taken to be non-linguistic, like theory of mind, for example. Yeah? Theory of mind causes symptoms, and derivatively of that, or concomitantly of that, pragmatic deficits in language. So you cannot use language properly because you cannot monitor the mental states of the person you're talking with. Yeah, that's a typical explanatory approach in both diseases. Now, there's many problems with this. I'll come to that in a moment. And there's another tempting view that kind of prevents people from going into this area or looking at this question, which is that aphasia is widely taken to be a problem with language, not cognition. Rosemary Varley is big on that. There's some dispute, especially from an American group around Baldo, Juliana Baldo, I believe. And so schizophrenia seems to be the opposite. It's a problem with cognition, not language. So patients with schizophrenia do not manifest typical aphasic symptoms. Yeah? So when people think language problem, okay, aphasia, then schizophrenia is not a language problem, because you don't see the aphasic language problems. Okay? So if schizophrenia is a language problem, it's not going to be an aphasic problem, so it's a problem with language in a different sense. And that's what you have to define. Okay? What is it about language which is weird in schizophrenia? Now here's another consensus that's kind of completely blocking progress in this question. It is sufficient to say that the consensus of psycholinguistic investigators is that schizophrenic language is non-existent, although schizophrenic thought abounds. So people make a radical, metaphysical almost, thought-language distinction. So they think there is a system called thought, which is expressed in language. Language is a tool to convey it, but thought is something distinct. Okay? Now, language is just a communicative tool. Okay? So if you see thought disintegrating, then there's no reason to expect this relates to language. Yeah? It's like if you have a computer and a printer. If the printer breaks, the computer doesn't necessarily break as well. Yeah? It's just the outlet which is broken. The way to get your mind out, yeah, there's a defect there, but not in the central processing, if you like. And so this view has been repeated over and over until the present day. Causation of schizophrenic speech defect lies in an underlying thought disorder rather than in linguistic inaccessibility. Ottitone, very recently very prominent and very good Canadian schizophrenia researcher, the thinking anomalies associated with psychotic conditions are not fundamentally speech or language disorders. Rather, when language is used in an idiosyncratic way, it represents the outcome of a deviant thought process. So there's an asymmetrical causal relationship, supposedly, between thought on the one hand and language on the other. What is the evidence for that is not clear to me. And what's the notion of language being used here? Clearly, thought is integrated with language, language not used in such a way that it expresses rational thought would be a parody. And thought that could not be expressed in language would not be thought of the same kind. So the two systems are integrated in their normal use. Okay, now here's a motivation for taking language more seriously. This is a typical list of neurocognitive variables that you would look at in a schizophrenic population in order to determine what is the cognitive disorders. You look at memory, executive function, attention, perception. And this is from a paper analyzing median effect sizes calculated from available meta-analyses of studies of these cognitive variables. You see, perception is relatively unimpaired in comparison to other cognitive functions. Declarative memory is strongly impaired, as is attention. And what you see here is language is listed among these variables, and it's also affected, as you would expect. Yeah? But then, what are the tests that measure that? Well, things like reading and spelling words, or the Boston naming tests, or things like that. That doesn't tell you a great deal about the role of language in cognition, and it doesn't dip very deeply into the structural aspect of language. Moreover, these cognitive impairments are seen against a background of very severe general intellectual impairments. So it's going to be really difficult to find specific impairments in particular cognitive variables. That has proved very difficult in the last decades. Now here's a very striking slide, which I got from Peter McKenna. Again, you have a list of mostly non-linguistic neurocognitive variables, and you try to correlate them with psychotic symptoms, namely grouped into three categories: negative symptoms, disorganization, and so-called positive symptoms. Now, the positive symptoms are the ones that are most characteristic of schizophrenia. They are symptoms like auditory verbal hallucinations or delusions. And you see there's lots of correlation between cognitive deficits and negative and disorganization symptoms, but not positive symptoms. Okay? So it would be interesting if you had really strong correlation between the positive symptoms and neurocognitive deficits. But here the problem has been to see correlation between these two. Even if you had correlations, the explanatory connection between these deficits and psychotic symptoms is not clear. So if, for example, if you have a memory deficit, why would this make you deluded? If you have an executive function deficit, why would this make you a hallucinator? Okay, so the connection is not clear and the correlations are difficult to establish, and they don't seem to be very prominent. Okay, so here that is some motivation to actually address this problem and to address what Bloider thought about language. So he said, thought block, poverty of ideas, incoherence, delusions, affective anomalies find their expression in language, but here the abnormality lies not in language itself, but in what it has to say. Okay, now that is very intuitive. If I say something weird, like, I don't know, Margaret Thatcher was a big benefit to Britain or so, then you might say I'm crazy, but it's not a linguistic problem that I have. Yeah? But if language stops to have to say something, if it stops carrying informational content about the world, yeah, then that may very well be an aspect inherently related to linguistic organization. Now, Bloider, who said that, was in line with this, quite clear in documenting a fundamentally different attitude that many of his patients had with language. So this is a famous letter from one of his patients who may or may not be writing from a place called New York. You see a little bit of that. Yeah, what he writes resembles that. And it kind of seems to be English. But then again, it's not. And most of the words are invented as some kind of Kunstsprache, okay? Which is used as if it was a normal language, without any insight into that it is not. And this is another example that Bloider gives, where a language is developed where image and symbolism is mixed, and the symbolism is of very different types. So the whole idea of what language is seems altered in these patients. There's another thing that is important in this connection. So Goddard said disorder of associations is the fundamental symptom of schizophrenia, where association indicates the normal connection between cognitive functions such as memory, attention, affect, perception, language, thought, speech, and so on. And if these associations break down, then you have a disintegration of the psychic function and thus a self-disturbance. But then we should ask what integrates all the psychic functions. It's in an utterance where they all come together. In any utterance you're making, perception, memory, encyclopedic knowledge, personhood, emotion, affect come together. And language is not like other cognitive variables because it transcends the boundary of your organism. It's necessarily shared and it carries truth values. So it resonates with the real world. And so if you look at the positive symptoms from this sort of linguistic perspective, you see language written all over the descriptions of these symptoms. So auditory hallucinations are typically verbal. When occurring with a schizophrenia diagnosis, they consist in a disorder of speech perception. Formal thought disorder is disorganized speech. That's how it's diagnosed clinically. Delusions are false and bizarre utterances that cannot be true. Here's some samples. How are you? Just have a read through that. Okay, so lots of neologisms, clanging, yeah, words associated with other words as opposed to words processed in grammatical contexts. And here's another example that I think we won't have the time for. A very different character of speech, clinically characterized as poverty of content. The patient talks a lot, but it's not clear what the patient says. That's just very poor content. Now, language has been invoked as a diagnostic tool. Syntactic changes, parameters of cohesion in text have been shown to be diagnostically distinctive for schizophrenia. There's a 95% accuracy in distinguishing schizophrenic texts from manics texts by virtue of certain syntactic criteria. And a strong motivation to look at what distinguishes these sorts of texts from each other and from normal speech is a particular view in theoretical syntax, which I have developed over a couple of years, which is the so-called radical view in Chomsky's terminology of the semantic interface, that there is no semantic component and that syntactic structure building is for certain semantic structures to arise. So there's no distinct level of thought, but thought is inherently integrated with grammatical structure building. There's no dichotomy there. Now, that leads to the question, what kind of meaning is grammatical meaning? What kind of meaning does pattern uniquely with forms of grammatical organization? And the answer in this framework that's being given is that if you move from a lexical item like man to a phrase like the man, then it's the phrase the man that can be referential, to pick out a particular man, whereas a lexical item as such cannot. So what you have at the side of grammar is a potential for reference, which you don't have at the lexicon. So the lexicon words can never be as such referential. If you want to make distinctions between the specific man, the man you met, a man, some man, men in general, these are grammatical distinctions. They arise at a grammatical level, not at a lexical level. Truth values arise at a grammatical level, at the full sentential level. And I think of this as grammatical meaning, not as semantics, because you have a restricted form, a restricted set of forms of reference, which range from generic to indefinite to definite, rigid, deictic, and personal ones. So starting from men in general to going on to a man, the man, Tom, this man, he, me. And this range of forms of reference which show an increase in referential strength or in specificity, if you like, patterns with grammatical distinctions, as Pino has especially shown for many years for the case of proper names for rigid designators. So these are grammatical distinctions, and they don't follow from any non-grammatical notion of semantics. Okay? So this is for me part of grammatical meaning. Okay, now grammatical meaning is propositional. What are propositions? Well, sentences that have propositional meaning carry information about the world. They are typically asserted as true. They are typically true when asserted. They carry novel information. They set a content-context boundary, so they are true or false irrespective of contextual factors, like whether I'm smiling or not when saying them. And they represent the content of a thought of a first person. Now, that sets up the triangulation. You speak, identifying yourself in the first person, to a second person, to whom you are connected through language, expressing a thought that always is about the world, viewed as a third or non-person, distinct from both of the first persons, the first and the second person. So all thought and language takes place in this sort of deictic frame. And that leads to the idea that this deictic frame, in which all thought and language takes place, could be disturbed in various ways, giving rise to cognitive disorders. And if you look at the three major symptoms in schizophrenia, this is how it would look. So the language baseline that connects the first and the second person is broken, leading to symptoms depending on which corner of this triangle you disturb. So auditory verbal hallucinations would affect the organization of the language faculty in terms of speech perception. You perceive speech where you shouldn't. From a thought disorder, what's disorganized speech is the production side of that, and indeed transcripts of voice speech can sound or look very similar to the disorganized speech output of thought disorder patients. Or you have the disorder in terms of the content that speech carries, which is the symptom of delusions. So that would be the cognitive phenotype of schizophrenia looked at from a kind of grammatical point of view. Now, what predictions does this sort of approach make? Well, in general, we should see symptom-specific distortions at the level of the kind of meaning that grammar on this approach is hypothesized to mediate. So what I call grammatical meaning, which was referential meaning, okay, propositional meaning. And the neural correlates of schizophrenia should concern language areas. And there's more specific predictions, like the more grammatical a form of reference becomes, which is to say the less lexical, the more severe the distortion should be. Okay, that's a very clear prediction. So we look at the hierarchy of reference and drew a line before the definite forms of reference. Yeah? So the disorders should lie there, not in the generic and non-specific part. Now, what are the findings? Let's review the findings on that basis. Well, insofar as there are lexical level anomalies at all, in thought disorder in particular, they transpire in the grammatical use of words in context. So these patients are usually pretty good on things like the Boston naming task. Lack of definiteness is almost a defining property of what's called poverty of content. That was one of the texts I gave you. And delusions tend to be definite. I'll give you some examples later. Grammatically referential devices in language pronouns in particular have long been noted to be particular loci of vulnerability in schizophrenia and in autism too. And the uncontrolled intrusion of a relevant aspect of context is a classical feature of discourse in thought disorder. So here's a sample from a patient of our study who suffers from severe delusion. So she thinks she's married to 7 husbands, and she has a lover also who's called Carl. So she says, see, the car, Carl, is impotent. Okay? So she begins a thought denoting a car, and is then distracted by the sound of the word and starts thinking about Carl, her lover. Okay? And most of what this person says, most of the referential phrases this person uses refer to things that don't exist, to events that don't take place, or to properties that she doesn't have. So what you can see here is this patient is fluent. Merge, in the sense of blind combinatorics, is not the problem. There's no problem with procedural memory either. She can put together words into a phrase. She's also a fully cooperative communicator. Pragmatically, there's nothing wrong there. She's answering questions and so on. But she cannot handle referential phrases, and her language largely does not carry propositional information. And she systematically mislocates herself in deictic space. So the thing she calls I never has the properties that she thinks it does. So she thinks she's the daughter of the queen, things like that. Now here's another famous example from Chika. My mother's name was Bill, where the grammar of the word, of the sound Bill, instead of a proper name, a referential phrase. Then she goes on after a pause, and Gu, And there apparently is this saying Bill and Coo, which means making love. So the grammar of Bill as a proper name is transformed into a verb denoting an action. And as you read on, you realize it's also transforming into a noun denoting the body part of a bird, the bill. So you see that semantics is not controlled grammatically, it's just floating around. Yeah? And the grammaticalization of particular lexical sounds just shifts as the text goes on. Yeah? So the control over meaning doesn't lie in grammar, but in lexical level associations. Yeah? We call it the lexicon unchained. That's a phenomenal reference, has long been noted. Okay, let's talk about delusions now briefly. As Jaspers, the big theorist of delusions, said, there's something basic and primary which comes before thought, the experiential, but they become clear to themselves only in thought. So they're really propositional. Now, they're linguistically highly articulated. They're not just feelings or so. There can be distortions in the experience of the thought process. I feel it's not I who is thinking, which is a disturbance in the didactic frame. There can be referential delusions, like this policeman is there only because of me. Or there can be what I call propositional delusions. I have a wine glass in my stomach, I wear my father's hair, I'm Jesus, the mafia is trying to kill me. Okay? Now, if you look at propositional delusions, actually linguistically quite specific. So I'm Jesus. In that case, Jesus refers to Jesus, not to I don't know, John the Baptist, not to Hitler. Right? So Jesus has its normal referential function, but the anomaly arises in the first person part plus the predicate that is attached to that first person. So delusions tend to have the grammatical first person in them. Hmm? So here's a number of types of delusions that I believe a clinician would not typically recognize as delusions, like Obama is Jesus. That's not a typical delusion that a patient would have. He would say, I'm Jesus. Yeah? I think I'm Jesus. Yeah, is of the wrong type linguistically to be a delusion. I am me is not a delusion, it's empty of content. Yeah? I'm not Wolfram, when I am Wolfram, it's not a possible delusion. Yeah? The movie was great, I bought a coffee this morning, he'll watch the movie tonight, German cities are beautiful. No, yeah? None of this is of the right form grammatically to be a typical delusion. So you can establish a linguistic profile of proposition illusions. They're non-embedded, non-negatable, non-tense, non-episodic, non-generic. Combine a grammatical first person with a third person predicate, and they are always referentially specific. Okay? So it's not kind of arbitrary, but it's a particular corners of grammar that are affected. Finally, voices, and I think I won't have time for autism, but finally voices. So you see a person shift in the most prototypical kind of voices, namely the so-called commanding and commenting voices. Here's an example from a patient who will be asked to transcribe what his voices were telling him. Okay? A tumor on the brain, they say. He's a sucker. You better pack it in. I'm going to give him an explanation. Alison, of who, of which, taught me my art at college. Grass him. It's all over. He does though. Help him. He has problems. He's keep wrestling. He needs Maltesers. Yeah, it goes on and on like this. Yeah, always the same thing. Okay? Now what we see here is a very interesting grammatical profile. So the total utterances are 552. And almost half of them, more than 40%, lack a lexical verb, yeah, or only have a copular verb. Hmm? From the forms of reference used, there's an overwhelming use of third person. So it's 319 in comparison to second person 14 and first person 29. So the voice hearer is addressed in the third person. These are his own thoughts, yeah, which have become third personal thoughts about him. Okay? So there's a distinctive grammatical profile which turns voice hearing into the phenomenon it is. It's inherently a linguistic phenomenon that has a specific linguistic index to it. And the only kinds of embedded clauses we found in this transcript are high-frequency kind of constructions, like they always know which buttons to press. So there's no embedding. Okay. Ipseity disturbances, self-worth disturbances, uncertainty over who thinks, would be predicted from a disturbance in the didactic frame that I mentioned before. Referential delusions are a disorder of the attribution of reference. Yeah, the policeman that stands there is thinking about me. Yeah, again, it's a person shift. So summary on schizophrenia. A linguistic typology, at least of the positive symptoms, and I could say something about negative symptoms, but so far just about positive symptoms. A linguistic typology of that seems to be in the cards. So you can think of delusions as a disorder in the referential use of language with a loss of didactic anchoring. So thoughts start to have a life on their own. They're not controlled by the first person. They appear as pure facts that are not anyone's thought, but just the world itself. Form of thought disorder, a loss of referential content. Nothing is being said anymore. There's a return to lexical associative and contextually driven rather than grammatical structuring of texts. And in hallucinations, you have an erasure of the normal boundary between linguistically articulated thought and speech. Normally thought is silent, and in this particular symptom, thought becomes pathologically loud. So when you're thinking, it's normally that nobody talks to you. If that starts to become speech, then there's an aspect of the organization of the language faculty which is disturbed. Okay, now that is the schizophrenia part. On the autism part, I just want to summarize and say there has been for a long time a view that the disorder lies in pragmatics primarily. But if you look at language symptomatology in autistic kids, we see that the idea of language is fundamentally different. And we see that in forms of self-reference, in particular, there's not so much a problem in taking the perspective of another person or in denoting yourself or knowing when you denote yourself. That usually is fine. What is not fine is to use language appropriately to express that. Let me just give you one example. This is a beautiful example, Germain, from the corpus of one of my collaborators, just this example. So he's eating soup with onion, and he hates onion, and he can't say it. And eventually he's exasperated, and he says, "Je veux te donner une pause." He says to the mother, the child says to the mother, he's 4-year-old, okay? He says, "Je veux te donner une pause." And the mother says, "Ah, tu veux que je te donne une pause." Okay, so give me a break, he says. He should have said, but he says, je veux te donner une pause. Yeah? So, do you see that? So he's taking the perspective of the mother, yeah, misusing all the pronouns, but what he's referring to with each of the pronouns is completely clear. Yeah? So je is the mother, te is the child, and the perspective is that of the mother. He wants the mother to give him a break. Okay? So taking a perspective is not the problem, it's the language, it's the person distinctions in language which are the problem. And that leads to a very interesting foundational question. What on earth is person doing in grammar? Which cognition, which type of cognition is our person distinction in grammar mediating? And that is the question which autism, I think, raises. And we see the same person problems, or at least person affected in both conditions, but in very different ways. Thank you.
A couple slides back, it was slide maybe 43, 44, you had a graph of things like person and number choices for there, right? Yes. Have you done the same kind of analysis of speech of people without impairments to see what the comparison is? I mean, how are these abnormal?
Yeah. We have been discussing this at length in the project. How could we get a good comparison corpus to see how distinctive that is? Now, if you look at these texts, and we have a lot of that, then phenomenologically, it does not seem to me that any normal speech situation could be like that. I mean, what could be a situation from which you could get a comparison corpus? What would it be? Well, we were thinking maybe you have a normal person sitting down on a table, and you get a couple of actors, yeah, who are instructed to talk down on that person, yeah, in that sort of fashion, talking to each other about the person who is present, because that is the situation in voice hearing. Yeah? But I just can't, first of all, the situation would be artificial. I would expect that these people would use a lot more first-person pronouns, which the voices don't do. The voices don't have a personal narrative. Yeah? They have identities, they have names often, but they don't have lives on their own. Just as they're lacking bodies, they're lacking a life on their own. Yeah? They don't have a narrative. And even very angry people, I think, would use the first person pronoun much more. But it would be an artificial situation. And they just can't see how to do this in a natural way, so to get a natural comparison of corpora. Yeah. If you have an idea, tell me. But for now, I think this is interesting enough, because it's linguistically distinctive.
Maria. Yes, thank you for this presentation. I think it's quite a complex phenomenon, but if you want to preserve perhaps the idea that merge, the binary operation is preserved somehow, you might want to look at sub-procedures of merge, things that makes merge going, right? So in some version of the minimalist program by Chomsky, you have this operation select that goes into a repertoire and then have certain kinds of feature and items from there. And then maybe the problem is not really with merge, but the sub-procedure of merge, or the sets of sub-procedures of merge, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just like one of the many possibilities, but the phenomenon is so complex.
I think that's a good idea. So if you think that the merge process involves labeling, for example, then you do see in the thought disorder transcripts that the categorical labels of the words are actually there. So in any particular moment of speech, you see, is this a verb, is this a noun, is this a proper name? But there's no stability in that, and the determination just disappears. There's just no maintenance of grammatical distinctions at the level of the discourse. So labeling, I would say, works on a momentaneous basis, but it doesn't give the discourse stability, or however you want to put it. But I agree with you, one could decompose the merge process, and it's clearly not just going to be merged in a purely formal sense, because phrases can be built, that's no problem. And the problem lies in how merge is integrated with interpretive processes, in reference in particular.
I want to ask you about your story about the relation between syntax and semantics, because if you had this list of properties of these things being known, there's no negation, there's no tense, they're not embedded, and there's no belief verb. So all this, what seems to be problematic is all these things that we think of as propositional operators.
Correct.
So, and that ties in well with your, the idea that you said that this stuff doesn't have proper propositional meaning.
Yeah.
But at the same time, all these elements don't have the same syntax in languages. So negation is not always where you would expect it, say, in front of the IP to do interpret as a propositional operator. Tense, the same thing. So two questions. One is, doesn't that tell you that there is actually some semantics going on in these things, in these areas, say post-syntactically? And second, wouldn't that also suggest at some level that there is some deficit in the functional structure that these patients seem to have? So, because all these things seem to be functional.
Cross-language comparisons, I think, would definitely be interesting, especially clitics would be really interesting to investigate, and hopefully you will be doing that. In terms of this question whether something semantic could be going on, I've always interpreted Pinot's work on the noun phrase in such a way that nothing independent semantic is going on. Yeah? In the sense that you can map a particular form of reference to a grammatical configuration. And that is my starting point here, because much of my work in the previous years has been on showing that this hierarchy of reference maps onto grammatical distinctions. So I would like to have that as a starting point, because that makes predictions. You know, it does make the prediction that the more grammatical a form of reference becomes, the more it would be impaired. And that's testable. I don't know whether that's an answer to what you said.
But, okay, it goes part of the way. So reference, you put the reference in the grammar, that's okay. So how about, say, when we move to quantification?
Well, indefinite noun phrases are clearly below the definite ones, and they have a grammar of their own. So in that sense, that's part of the grammar. Clearly, quantification is part of the grammar. Yes, sure. Obviously, there's maybe aspects of the semantics of quantification that you cannot map to, that you cannot interpret configurationally. I don't know enough about this to draw the line between the two. But I think there's enough grammatical signature, two forms of reference, to actually investigate the connection between the loss of referential competence and grammatical competence.
I was sort of thinking, one thing that might be a possible consequence of this is that so a lot of the symptoms that you find certainly in ASD and maybe also schizophrenia also occur at some frequency in non-clinical populations, and this is sort of a spectrum of symptoms. Right? So you would expect some of the grammatical diagnostics to also occur at some frequency in non-clinical populations.
Well,
I wonder, and sort of also thinking about a companion corpus to this, like if you tried to get somebody to do the sort of hard task of writing down your internal narrative of some event, could you get a frequency of certain grammatical things that would,
I briefly mentioned, but I didn't go into detail, that people have tried to establish the linguistic profiles of formal thought disorder, and they have compared this to, for example, mania. And there's differences and overlaps. So schizophrenia has no prerogative over thought disorder and these forms of speech that do occur in other populations, maybe even in normal population, but in different ways. So for example, in normal population, only if you are very excited or there's something emotional going on, whereas in thought disorder, this would be more permanent. So there's always differences that you can see, and also I would say in specific linguistic parameters like pronoun use or so, I think you would see differences there, and Wax and Leff in 1982 have established this via cohesion markers. So there's specific linguistic indices that I would predict tell these populations apart.
Yeah, this is a question about the control group issue. Would there be some reason why you wouldn't want to, say, compare these hearing voices with, say, mediums, where they are reporting voices that they're hearing and things like that? And I mean, I know there's a nature of the metaphor about how they hear them that could be an issue here, but I was just wondering why you'd ruled that one out.
So what is the phenomenon you're thinking about? So when
so, for example, I'm basically conning people into giving me money to tell them about their dead relatives, which is obviously a big industry. And I am hearing voices. Now, usually I know that in the studies that have been done, the metaphor is that there's a crackly line, which may affect the nature of how the voices are reported. I mean, maybe the nature of the experience here is different from that. I was just wondering why you would rule that one out as a possible comparison, because data does exist on that.
I see. Well, that is interesting, and I have to look into that. Yeah, no, thank you. And you also mentioned before the inner speech narratives. This I find really difficult. So let me try to answer both of these points at the same time. So there is a thing called the default state, where stuff is going on, your mind is wandering, and there's language, fragments of language wandering around in your brain. But the moment you were to write this down, you stop the default state. So that's not an accurate account of what goes on in the default state. And then there is inner speech, when you're muttering to yourself, so you're saying, just get up, start working, do it well. And Anders Holmberg has worked on that. And the character of that, I think, is fundamentally different. And this person shift you would never see. So basically you already know that the linguistic profile would be different in that case. So why waste time on actually establishing it? And in this particular case, I think I would predict one crucial element will be missing, namely what clinicians sometimes call delusional ideation. So in schizophrenia, so when voices occur within schizophrenia, we know they occur in many other conditions and in normal people, but if they occur in schizophrenia, they are often accompanied by delusional ideas. For example, you don't just hear a voice and you're puzzled by it and you tell your friends what weird stuff the voice has said, but you think the devil is talking to you, or your dead mother is talking to you. And you find this a possible hypothesis, and you stick to it. And so the level of insight or meta-reflective power into the phenomenon is very different in the two cases. How that translates into a difference in the grammatical profile, I'm not sure. But I think these two forms of hearing something are really different.
So I guess there's no other questions. We'll stop here. Thank you.